guys, welcome to the live Q&A for the National Poetry Summit. I am your host, Shane Maynor, and I set this up for the email subscribers for this month-long campaign I'm doing through email to help poets really take advantage of National Poetry Month and own it like a boss. So today, what I have done is sent out a questionnaire basically and asked the subscribers what are some of the main questions and concerns they have with their craft and poetry in general. And today we are going to address those. So I have 5 questions that were submitted that we're going to go over today, and they are good ones, y'all. So we're going to dive right into it. The first one that was submitted was, what is something other than writing prompts I can use for inspiration and to challenge me as a writer? So we've all been there. Maybe you've gone to a writing workshop and you've showed up and you're ready, and maybe you've even brought some of your poetry there to get critiqued, and you show up and they just give you a writing prompt. They are not hard to come by. We all have Google. There are tons of them on the internet. So what do you do if you're a writer and you are just getting writing prompt after writing prompt and you feel like you aren't growing or it's not challenging you? So again, in this situation, Google is your friend. I highly suggest looking into poetry forms, and those could be haikus, sonnets, villanelles, anything of that nature. There's a poetry form called the Bop that's really good for beginners, just entering into form poetry. All of these things can be found on the internet. Just search poetry forms or forms of poetry, and you can find those, and they really challenge you because there's line restrictions, there's syllable restrictions. All of these things will challenge you as a writer. Definitely a pro tip in this as well. A lot of publication companies are really impressed by poetry forms. And if you think about it, they're getting submissions all of the time from poets, and most of them are going to be free-form poetry. And not to knock free-form poetry at all, but if you think about it, some of these publishers are educators. They're highly educated in poetry forms. So when they get a submission from a poet who has used a poetry form, especially a more complex one, they're very impressed. And 9 times out of 10, they're more than likely to publish that poem because it's shown that the poet has done their work. They've really challenged themselves to use these restrictions to say what they're trying to say through their poetry. So that's also a great tip. Another thing you can do is challenge yourself to write outside of your comfort zone. For example, there's a few poetry games I love to play, and I teach my mentors this as well, and my students. I play this game where it's fall in love with an inanimate object. So no matter where you are, whether it be a pencil or maybe it's a fan or just anything random that's in the room, just try to picture falling in love with that object and make a connection to that object and write about that. So it's kind of like taking the writing prompt to a whole nother level and making you think outside the box and outside of the norm. Another poetry game that you can play is find the poem in the room, where you basically people watch and you find someone and pay very close attention to, without seeming like you're a creeper or anything. Pay attention to their movements, what they're doing, the expression on their face, and you create a backstory from that person. And so that also teaches story poetry, where you're creating a story within your poem. And so that's another way of taking that writing prompt to a whole nother level. The other thing that you can do to challenge yourself as a writer is to team up with another writer and try to do a group piece. Even if you're not a spoken word performer or a spoken word poet, this is a really great exercise to do, because now you're having to work with your own craft to match someone else's and to make it flow and make it make sense, and you're feeding off of each other. So don't be afraid to team up with another poet and try that as well. But I highly, highly suggest that you look into poetry forms and forms of poetry. That's really, really going to push you and also help you get more publications. So yeah, don't get frustrated. We've all been there. We've gone to writing workshops, and hopefully you haven't paid for them and all they do is give you a writing prompt. And if they do, don't go back. Or contact the host and be like, hey, is there maybe next time we meet, can we take it to the next level, something like that, and maybe it'll push them as well to make their writing workshops more involved. The next question we have is, how do I handle nervousness when getting up on the mic? So I get this a lot. A lot of poets, especially who share their work, they get that question a lot of, are you nervous? Do you still get nervous, especially if they've been doing it for a long time? So the good news is that there are a lot of techniques to help you with nervousness and also confidence that are subconscious. So it's not even something that you really have to really, really focus on. It'll actually do that for you. So yes, you will be nervous, and if you stay on stage a lot, it won't be as bad the more you get up on stage, but you will probably still have the butterflies, especially in different atmospheres, depending on the crowd and depending on how large or small the crowd is. So one of the things you can do is there are grounding techniques. So what are grounding techniques? So basically, grounding techniques are anything that you can do with your body to calm you down before you go to speak. So this is something you will do as soon as you get to the mic. So I know some poets that tap on their leg, and it's just to remind them that you are here, you are present, you are worthy, and it kind of grounds you in that motion where you're just tapping on your leg and then they go to speak. Another technique you could do is roll your shoulders back. Make sure your posture is up and straight. And what that also does is help you with projection with your voice, and it also subconsciously helps you with confidence. If you're up there and you're like this reading your poem, you're of course going to feel vulnerable and scared, and you look it. But if you go up there and you roll your shoulders back, all you have to do is once roll your shoulders back, deep breath in, deep breath out, another deep breath, and then go into the first line of your poem. It'll come out with confidence, and then you will relax within the poem and feel way better up there reciting it. But definitely remember, take that big breath in first. You might feel a little awkward because it might feel like you're standing up there for a long time, but really you're not. I've done features where I'm like, how much time do I have left? And they're like 15 minutes, and I'm like, oh wow, I haven't been up here that long. Every moment that you're up there feels like an eternity, but it's really not. Give yourself the time to get ready and to get posture and to take that big breath in, and just remember that you have something important to say. The other thing is you can do tongue twisters before you go up. This also helps with articulation, and it helps you get ready and focused as well. My slam mates in Respect the Mic, they always do this one that goes, the lips, the teeth, the tip of the tongue, the lips, the teeth, the tip of the tongue. And it kind of works your mouth and gets your mouth exercised to really do the piece and be focused that you are going up to do poetry and you want to be heard. The other thing, and spoken word poets know this, like it's one of the first things that you have to remember when doing spoken word is remember why you wrote it. So while you're up there taking your big breath, just remember in your head why you wrote this, why it's important to you, and that will also give you confidence and kind of reestablish, what it is you're really doing up here and why you're doing it, and that it matters because your voice matters. And building that practice of worthiness and self-love before you read your piece is going to make a huge difference in the long run. So just remember any kind of technique that can ground you, whether it be tapping on your leg, just as a subconscious reminder that you're present, you're grounded, you're focused. Some poets snap, and they do it subconsciously before they go into their piece, because that's a grounding technique for them as well. It's like, okay, I'm here, I'm ready to do this. So figure out what works best for you. I was just telling one of my clients that I'm doing poetry mentoring for, that whatever you use to ground you might actually change per poem. So you might have a poem where you tap on your leg before you do the piece, and then the next poem you might do something completely different because it's a different emotion and it's a different shift in your mind. So, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be just one thing you do. It's a whole lot easier if it's just one thing, but just make sure that whatever it is you're doing comes natural to you, and it's like a comfort to remind you that you're there, you're present, you're focused. The other thing is definitely breathing techniques, you guys. When I say take that big breath in, it makes a world of difference. So, before you go up, normally when you're about to go up to speak. Just remember, breathe in, breathe out. There's an amazing breathing technique that really, really helps with calming down, where you breathe in through your nose for 5 seconds. You hold the breath for 5 seconds, and you exhale out your mouth for 5 seconds. And it does wonders. Just do that about 3 times, and you will be amazed at how much just focus you have, how much confidence that you've gained just in those 3 breaths, and also how calm you feel. So definitely try that out before you go up. The third question, memorization help. So if you're a poet and you're tired of reading off your phone, you're tired of reading off of a page, maybe your hands shake, even though your voice isn't shaking, but your hands are shaking, and you've discovered it's distracting to the audience. So you want to memorize your poems. There are a lot of techniques that help with that. People get overwhelmed all the time, and I hear this constantly, where like, oh, I'm too old to memorize a poem, or I'm too ADD, and all that. But you can do it. Trust me, you can do it. So how I memorize, and how I know a few other poets memorize, is by pacing. So you take your poem and you pace when you memorize. And I didn't realize this until years later, but the movement of pacing actually triggers the memory part of your brain. And I read that in an article, and I was like, oh, okay, now maybe that's why I do that. You can memorize a 2-page poem in a few hours by pacing. Seriously, you might be tired afterwards, but it really does help. So remember, get up, stand up, don't sit and memorize. Get up, walk around the room. That walking helps with the memorization part of your brain. I always suggest go 2 lines. Try to memorize your poem by 2 lines. So the first 2 lines, repeat those over and over and over until you don't have to look at the poem anymore. Then do the next 2 lines. You will run into a line that might have a tongue twister, or if you're using a lot of alliteration, you might have to break that line down to where you're just memorizing those few words. So repeat those few words over and over until you can say them without tripping up, without looking at the page, and then try to do the whole line over and over and remember it. I always go about halfway down into the poem, and then I stop, and then I see how far I've gotten with the memorization by trying to read from the beginning to the middle out loud without looking. And then after I've gotten half of the poem memorized, I repeat that technique for the second half. And when I get to the end, I combine both halves and read them without looking at the page. The more you break it down and go piece by piece, the easier it is for you to remember. Another thing that helps, I don't personally do this, but I know it helps a lot of other poets. Record yourself and listen to it back. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about, well, we know song lyrics, right? So a song comes on the radio and you didn't sit down with the lyrics and, go line by line trying to memorize the lyrics. You've just heard it so much that you know the lyrics. So this really does help with memorization. And I always bring this up when I hear that, oh, I can't memorize anything. And I'll be like, well, is there a song you know? And I'm like, you can memorize then. So it's just taking the time out to do this, and if you're really serious about it, you'll get really far with it, and you'll find out how easy it really is. And practice, you guys, practice in front of your mirror, in front of your friends, practice alone at the house. It might drive your neighbors crazy, but yeah, practice your poems, because the more you say them, the more you're going to remember. Another thing is adding in movements. I just was discussing this last night with a poet. Add in movements within the line. Find out if there's something in that line where you can add in a hand gesture or something like that. I have a poem where it goes, I have a soul full of words and a pen like a bat, and I always make like I'm swinging a bat motion, and it's actually an anchor to help me remember the next line after. So a lot of poets are also visual artists. So if you create a storyboard in your head of the poem, and that'll help you figure out what gestures are there, but it'll also help you figure out what's the next line in this poem, because you're following the storyboard through your head. And these movements will be anchors for you. There's a few poets in Charlotte I know that snap during certain lines of their poem, and the audience doesn't know, but they're actually using that snap as an anchor to remember the next line. And it's also good to take a second and snap if you're stumbling over the next line in your head. So all those little techniques will help you with memorization. So the fourth question, this is a big one. How do I deal with constructive criticism without it wrecking me? I am so glad that we got this question, because this is huge. This is huge for poets, and it's so important if you want to grow in your craft. So I have seen a lot of times that poets are desperate for feedback on their poetry, but they'll get, oh, it was great, I really enjoyed it, and then the poet gets frustrated because they didn't really get any constructive criticism. So then they send it to someone who they know is, gonna really be honest with their work, and it completely destroys them, and they don't write for a month, or maybe they don't even touch that poem for a month because they're so distraught that they've not done the best of their ability, or it wasn't as well constructed as they thought it was. So you have to remember, poets, please remember that in order for you to grow in your craft, you need constructive criticism. And I'm not saying that criticism as in, oh, that sucks, I don't like that poem. I'm saying like, well, this line didn't really make sense, it doesn't really flow with the poem, you go off beat here, this doesn't sound right, these two lines are contradictory to themselves. Did you mean for it to be contradicting? Things like that. You really, really need that in order to grow as a poet. If you don't have that, you only have your own judgment. And especially if you're sharing your poetry, depending on what your purpose is for your poetry, it could be detrimental to you to not have constructive feedback. Because let's say you're a spoken word poet, right? And the whole purpose to your poetry is to really connect with the crowd and get them to understand where you're coming from, or maybe even to save their life or change their life. It is hugely important for you to know how the poem is coming across. So you need that feedback to see how your audience is interpreting the poem. Now, granted, it's going to change from person to person more than likely. But you really need that feedback to find out what they think you're saying. If you want to get them to feel what you're feeling, or get them to change the way they think about something, you really need to know, is this offensive? Is this being understood? All those things. So don't be afraid of editing your work. You can always keep the original. There are slam poets who I've known that get very attached to the work because it is personal. I mean, let's be real. All these poems are usually about something deeply personal that's happened to us. So when someone tells us, oh, this doesn't make sense, or I didn't really think that it was as strong as I thought it could be. And when you're talking about a strong emotion that you've felt and you've written it out, and someone's telling you that it's not strong, when you know that the feeling behind this poem was strong, that it can really hurt. But you have to keep in mind that this is really about communication. Like, the whole purpose of a poet, or the definition of a poet, is a communicator. So bear that in mind. And remember, you can always keep your originals. Some slam poets, they have to completely reconstruct their poem just for competition. And that's okay. If that's the goal of what you're going to do with this poem, you can always have the original and read it at an open mic or at a feature or whatever it is you're doing with that piece. You can always do the original there and do the slam poem strictly in slam. There's nothing wrong with that. There are poets who have 10 different versions, if not more, of one poem. You can have multiple versions. There's no taboo against that. No one's gonna shame you for that. So play with your poetry. Consider it like you're playing with it. Don't be afraid to do that. It'll help you expand. It'll help you sharpen your craft. Definitely don't be afraid to have multiple versions. And it's a great way too if you're like a poet from the first question who is like, what do I do if I'm sick of writing prompts? You can always take one of your poems and try to turn it into something completely different. A great exercise to do is take a poem that has a lot of I's and me and is very personal, and take all the I's and me's out of it and completely change the perspective. And that's a great practice to do to really flip your poems around and really start experimenting with, how can I say this in a completely different way or in a completely different voice. So don't be afraid of that. Remember that if someone gives you constructive feedback about a poem, you can always keep the original and do the edits. I used to be huge against edits. When I was younger, I thought, no, the poem is pure the way it comes out. And now I've learned, I'm like, sometimes the things that first came out, it's very jumbled. It's in the heat of the moment. Sometimes maybe I didn't have a lot of time to invest in it. And of course it feels good because I got what was inside of me out. But looking back a few years later on the poem that I thought was so amazing, I'm like, there are so many lines in this that's confusing, and I didn't really execute this the way that I could have. So don't be afraid to edit your work, and don't be afraid of people who are willing to help you, because that's all it is. That's a whole nother form of support that you really do need as a poet. So our last question is, I want to release a chapbook. Any advice? Yes. So there is a lot that goes into this, and this is why I saved this question for last. So I think it's very, very, very important for poets to get published, whether it be self-publishing or actual publishing. And we're going to get into that in a minute, about what's the difference between self-publishing and going through a publisher. If you are a poet, no matter if you are a spoken word poet, if you are a written page poet, you want to get your stuff published either in a spoken word album or a chapbook. And if you don't know what a chapbook is, it is basically like a small collection of poetry, and usually themed. So you want these things because if you go to a reading or an open mic or you're featured, you want the audience to be able to take away something that they can look back on, and not just a photo on their phone or a selfie with you or a 15-second recording, of your poetry set. You want to be able to give them something that they can remember, and then they can go back and read your work, and that gives you longevity in your work, and it also helps spread your poetry out there into the world, because more than likely they're gonna post a picture of a page and share it with their friends, or they're gonna talk about it. They might even let one of their friends borrow the book, or get their friends to buy your book. So you want that, and it's also a great way to have merchandise to sell when you're featuring and things like that. We're not gonna try to lie and say there's a lot of money in it, but it'll help you pay for your books. It'll help you get gas money to the next show. It'll help you with finances in general, supporting your craft. So let's start off with chapbooks and how they're designed. So if you're a poet starting out and you don't have a chapbook yet, you really, really need it to be themed. And what I mean by that is take all your love poems. That's going to be your first chapbook. Or take all your fighting through depression poems. That's going to be the first chapbook. Poems about your mother. Things like that. You want it themed. And here's why. Even if you're self-publishing, you do not want to come out with a collection of work that is just has no theme throughout the poems, and they're all kind of jumbled in there, because it's like a band releasing a best of album first. It just doesn't make any sense. Publishers too, if you want to get it published, it's going to have to be themed. If they get a chapbook submission from you and it's all these poems that don't really go together, and it doesn't really have a structure, 9 times out of 10 they're just going to set it down. They're not even going to read past probably the 4th poem. They might not even read it in general. So it needs to be themed. The other thing you need to keep in mind is how many poems you need for a chapbook. And normally the lowest you want to put in there is 23 or 24 poems. So you need at least that many. If you're getting published, you need to keep in mind that poems are usually 1 page. Some of them might be able to spill over into 2 pages, but a lot of publishers want 1 poem per page. So that you're going to have to consider that when you're crafting your pieces and editing them for the book. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is get reviews. Get reviews. Even if you're self-publishing, you need reviews from poets who are well respected in the community. And here's another pro tip. Consider your target market. Who's more than likely going to be buying this book? If you have a book about love poems, more than likely, we're going to say women. I know it's stereotypical, but we have to be thinking about the general populace that will be buying your book. More than likely, it's going to be women. So what is a poet in the community, or who is a poet in the community, that these women might go, oh, they gave this amazing review for this book, and that makes me want to buy it even more. So when you're picking who to submit your chapbook to get a review, keep your target market in mind, because that's going to matter. Do not be afraid to send your chapbook out to get reviews. I got one of the poet laureates from a few years back to review my book, and I didn't know if he was going to do it or not. I sent Joseph an email, and I was like, look, this is my first chapbook. I would love it if you would review my book, and and I'll put it on the back of the cover, and that's where you want to put the reviews as well, because you want people to be able to see them when they pick up your book, to go, oh wow, they're getting recommendations from these people. I've got 3 on the back of mine because that was what the publisher, that was the minimum. Maximum 2. You needed 3. I sent him an email, and I was like, I didn't know if I figured he'd say no, but it can't hurt to ask, right? I was very humbled and surprised that he was like, yes, please, I'll definitely do that. So don't be afraid. The worst thing they can say is no, and just move on. If they say no, don't email them back and be like, why, just move on to the next person on your list. So make a list of people who you think are well respected in the community and see if they'll review your book. The other thing that you need to take into consideration is an editor. So you might think you're very confident in your work and that you don't need an editor, even if you're self-publishing. A lot of self-publishers, people who self-publish their own book, they go, oh, I'm not paying for someone to edit my book and stuff like that. I want it to be mine. I want to do everything myself. The problem with that is you can stare at something 10 times and not see the mistakes you made. Really get other people to go over your book and see if there's any grammar errors, something that doesn't look right, maybe a line break that is odd or could be constructed better. Get someone to edit your book. Even if you don't take all of their advice and their suggestions for the edits, you still need that, because you can have 3 people look at it and still be like, oh man, your book's out, you've got 200 copies of your book to sell, and there's still a misspelled word on page 5, So please, please, please find some people to go over your book, review it, and make editing suggestions and comments. So let's dive into the big question of, do I self-publish or do I go through a publisher? So here's the thing. There's nothing wrong with self-publishing your book. You're still going to sell as many copies. It's all in how you sell your book and how you sell yourself. The thing about going through a publisher to get your book published and sell is that you're going to get more notoriety. You're going to get like a longevity, because a lot of publication companies will have your book on file. It'll be documented. It'll be in their safe kept in their online vault or whatever it is that they use for their files and their the poets who have submitted work. So there's a longevity in that. It's almost the same as artists who paint on maybe like a cheap canvas from Walmart, as opposed to a high-end canvas that won't yellow over time, that has, archival value. It's almost the same as that. So there are a lot of advantages to publishers. The one thing that you have to keep in mind is that your book can get rejected. So you might have to try several publishers. So it's a longer process, because it has to be reviewed as well in order to, be approved for publication. You're going to have to go back and forth with their editor and their publisher. The other thing you have to keep in mind are, what are the terms of sale? For example, if they sell your book at a poetry festival, do you get part of that profit? All these things you're going to have to figure out, and you really need to research. Please research the publishers that you go through so you can figure out what's best for you. Another great perk to getting your book published through a publisher is they will promote you to their subscribers, to other poets. They'll have your books at their events for sale. There'll be a lot of media and exposure through a publisher, and they help you with that, as opposed to doing it yourself and trying to get your work out there, just you. They have like a whole team of people that work on strictly media and marketing. It's just you. You got to do the Facebook posts. You got to do the social media, the Instagram, setting up book signing releases. Some publishers will even help you set up book signings, which is fantastic. So do your research. The big thing about self-publishing, though, is it's cheaper, it's faster, and if you're sitting on a lot of poetry and really need to get it out so you can move on to the next step, it's a great advantage for you. You have complete control over the cover, over the way everything's laid out inside of the book. It's easy. There's print-on-demand companies where sometimes with publishers you have to order a certain amount. With print-on-demand, you can order 5 if you want to, instead of like 100. So if you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of time, and you really need to get this out, self-publishing is a great way to go. And just because you self-publish doesn't mean that you can't publish through a publisher later. You probably cannot submit that self-published book unless you're submitting it to a chapbook contest. But it's a great way to get it out there and to move on to the next step. And a lot of times you get your books very fast. You'll get them in like, I think it's like 2 weeks or something like that. The only disadvantage is you don't have someone on the other end going, hey, the format of this page don't look quite right, let's work on this, things like that. It's all on you. You don't have a designer doing your book. You either have to find a designer or do it yourself. There's a lot more work that goes into it, which depending on how much work it is, it might equal out the same time frame as if you tried to go through a publisher. So really look at where you're at and what would work best for you. It can be fast, but you also got to think of quality too. Some publishers, the quality of their books are beautiful, are absolutely beautiful. The pages are a thicker paper, the covers, there's even some that do a hardcover chapbooks. But if you self-publish, 9 times out of 10, I mean, you're getting what you pay for. They're going to be very thin covers. They're going to be very thin paper. Any mistakes that you have made in there that didn't get caught are going to be printed that way, and then it's too late. You have it, A publisher will at least, there'll be a few other eyes on it. So those are like the 2 differences to publishing. So just pick whichever one works best for you. I hear a lot of times poets are scared to submit their first book to a publisher, and they want to self-publish. So my advice to that is you'll never know until you try. I say submit that book to several publishers and see what kind of response you get. Then, if everybody rejects it, self-publish it. But I would try to get your first book published through a publisher, and that will help you so much with your book signings and your features and really just promoting your book in general, especially if it's your first, because a lot of times your first book, you're going to feel vulnerable, you're going to feel scared, it's new territory, don't know what you're doing, so having that support team on the other end is a huge advantage. So just try it. Submit it to some people and see who bites. And if no one bites, then go ahead. Get it done, So I wanted to add a bonus thing on here before we end today. And the bonus thing is, a lot of these questions I noticed that I got for the live Q&A, there's a lot of vulnerability in this. So it's, this is the first step before, like, publishing my chapbook, or I'm nervous on the mic, or, I'm getting feedback, but I don't know how to receive it. I think the only question that wasn't kind of like a beginner with exposure is what is something other than writing prompt. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit before we end about the whole vulnerability aspect. So, and I'm just going to be completely honest with you guys, because this is important. That vulnerability is never going to go away. If you do your craft well, you want that vulnerability. You want that feeling of transparency and nakedness, because that's what makes the art form pure. So make peace with that. Make peace with that naked feeling. Make peace with that, I don't know how this is going to go. I don't know how well it's going to be received. Make peace with that, because if you let that stop you, then there are so many other experiences that you could have had. There's so many other people that you could have touched and saved, or new fans that you could have gained, or just exposure, everything that you could have gained if you let that vulnerability feeling stop you. So I hear a lot of time from people like, oh, well, I don't have the tools yet, or I'm not experienced enough yet. Just do it. Just do it. The only way you're going to grow and get out there is to do it. And I really, 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 really am amazed at the love that's in all kinds of like poetry circles and communities. So you will get the support you need, and if you ask for it and you just say, hey, this is how I'm feeling, and can we talk about this, or do you have any advice for me? Never be afraid to ask. And if someone doesn't want to talk to you about it or seems a little off-putting, move on to the next person, because I guarantee you there are people in the poetry community who will support you, who will help you. Do not be afraid to ask. That vulnerability that you feel is a good thing. So make peace with it and work on the nervousness and your confidence. And I'm really, really blessed to be able to do this National Poetry Month Summit with my email subscribers, because there's so many things within being a poet that need attention when it comes to self-care and self-love, because we do live different lifestyles. And when you're constantly being transparent on the stage or on the page, there is a lot of feelings that go behind that vulnerability. And to practice self-love and self-care, and remember that what your story is important, your voice is important, and what you have to say is important, and the whole nobility that comes with being a poet, to really understand what it is you're doing and your craft is huge for you to be healthy. We glorify a lot of these lifestyles from classic poets that were awful, that were, detrimental to their health mentally and physically. And although their work was amazing, the side effects, or I wouldn't say side effects, the lifestyles and the choices that they made are not necessary. And I think we get it into our head that in order to be a poet or an artist, you have to suffer. And that's not the case. Yes, there is pain in this, because we're facing hard truths a lot of times with the world and in ourselves. And that feeling of vulnerability can even be a type of pain, but it doesn't have to be a detrimental pain. You can still be healthy and live a happy life and do amazing work without it completely just tearing your life apart. So I'm really blessed that I get to, dish out self-care and self-love tips for poets. So if you're not an email subscriber, please check out my website, and you can sign up through there. It's shanemanor.com. So sign up. I mean, it don't cost you anything, and there's tons of advice and support that goes out. My whole passion is just to help other artists and help humanity just be empowered and uplifted through the arts. So yeah, hopefully that helps you guys. You can always email me too, and I'll talk to you and try to help any way I can. It was great to do this with you guys today and go over these questions. And thank you everyone who submitted and who signed up for the email. And hopefully you guys are on track with your National Poetry Month goals. If you're not, read back through those emails, follow those tips, get you some structure, and you can always email me, like I said. But I hope you guys have a fantastic day. It is beautiful here in North Carolina. So go live a little and write about it and create.